I'm Zibby Owens. I'm the host of the podcast Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And I'm thrilled that Courtney Sullivan said yes and that she would do this with me tonight. So thank you so much to her. This is her latest book. Oops, the cover's coming off. Friends and Strangers, which we're going to talk about tonight. And just I'll read you the bio from the flap. Courtney Sullivan is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels Commencement, Maine, The Engagements, and Saints for All Occasions, and Friends and Strangers. Her work has been translated into 17 languages, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, New York Magazine, Elle, Glamour, Allure, Real Simple, and Oh, the Oprah Magazine, among many other publications. It says she lives in Brooklyn with her husband and two children, but I feel like she moved. Didn't you move, Courtney?
I did move. So we're now living outside of Boston in Massachusetts, where I'm from originally. We've just moved here, so it's kind of a whole new world.
How's that going?
It's interesting. I don't know. You know, we've been in New York, in Brooklyn for about 20 years, my husband and I. So I don't really know if this is a permanent move or, you know, I feel like everybody's lives right now are so in flux, or so many people's anyway. And we are definitely among them. I just don't know where we will be a year from now. I feel like all of my books tend to have some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And when I wrote this one, I wrote about a couple leaving Brooklyn and ending up in that case, very close to the husband's hometown. And somehow we found ourselves in a situation similar, which I really couldn't have dreamed of or imagined even a year ago.
Wow. I feel like everybody would agree with you that nobody could have anticipated where they were today, and who knows where we'll all be in a year. I mean, the craziest stuff. Yeah.
It's so strange.
So are you planning then on, you know, stalking your mom's Brooklyn Mamas group like you wrote in the book now that you're out of town? Have you been on any message boards or feeling some sort of
I'm always on the message board. So I am actually now in the Facebook group for the town I'm living in, and it's interesting. It's like a slightly different flavor than the one I was on in Brooklyn. I think partly because there's a lot of men in this one, and I've never really been part of a Facebook group where men were present. I feel like usually it's a woman's domain, and a lot more sort of juicy stuff gets covered. This is more like, where do you get trash stickers and, you know, things like that. There's a fox on the loose, like, you know, it's not very juicy.
I'm in one of those, we have a place in LA that now we can never get to, and it's very sad, but yeah, it's always like, yeah, there's a puppy wandering around. What should we do? Did anyone hear that loud explosion? And I'm like, okay.
Yes, exactly.
But it helps you stay in touch with the community, so that's nice.
That is true. That is true.
So I don't know who read your book or who didn't, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So I was hoping maybe you could just give a little synopsis in addition to it being about a woman who left Brooklyn, for the people who maybe they didn't read it and they won't want to.
Yes. Yeah. So Friends and Strangers is the story of two women, each kind of at a crossroads. The younger woman, Sam, is, I think, 21 years old. She's quite young. She's a senior in college. She sort of feels like she's done with college, but college is not done with her. So she's there for this final year, but kind of ready to move on in life. At the same time, she's really terrified of what the future might hold. She has student loan debt. She's just sort of unsure what will happen. And she has this kind of ill-advised love affair that she's a part of as well, with a much older man. And she sort of collides with this woman, Elizabeth, who has just moved to this small town from Brooklyn, has just had her first baby, and hires Sam to be a babysitter. And over the course of this 1 year together, they kind of, in many ways, sort of shape the course of one another's lives. But the friendship doesn't last. It's not that kind of a friendship. It's one of those friendships that sort of could only exist in one particular moment. And that's what the book is about. And, you know, on a larger level, I guess, you know, it's really about motherhood. It's about friendship. It's about also kind of how we got where we are as a country, the sort of hollowing out of the social safety net and all kinds of things like that.
Yes, the Hollow Tree subplot
Yeah.
Situation, which was like, It was awesome. It was like 1 minute you're in the weeds of motherhood, and the next minute there are all these intellectual debates about the state of society. So it was great. It's like you get everything, your whole fill in one book. Any mood you might be in, it's perfect. Can we go back to Clive, who's the love interest of Sam, the inappropriate perhaps? So yeah. How did you come up with the idea that he would be a walking tour guide in London? Because that's just like, it's such a random profession and so cool. And I actually just like in February went on one of those tours in London. And so it was like very fresh in my mind. I'm wondering, did she go in on one of these tours and just wonder like, what's this guy's life like? Like what happened? How did you come up with that?
A lot of this book is based on my own life. And I had to adjust Sam because the novel is happening in the present day. And in the first drafts, I really wrote Sam as if she were in college when I graduated in 2003. So I had to sort of bring her more up to date in the later versions because I knew I wanted Elizabeth to be experiencing motherhood as it happens right now. So, but I did spend a year living abroad, living in London, and I took a year off from Smith and was a nanny for a year. And I met my inappropriate older Clive, British man, in the middle of Leicester Square when he was wearing a spacesuit. He was a DJ, of course, like who, it has to be a DJ. And he was out promoting his friend's club where he was going to be DJing. And that was the person where I was like, I'm madly in love and I think I should change my whole life and, move back to London and marry this DJ. So as sometimes happens, truth is stranger than fiction. And my editor and agent were like, I don't know, the DJ, the spacesuit, it just feels like a little too much. And I was like, okay, well, that's what really happened, but fine. So, but the one thing about, my life when I lived in London, I loved walking tours. Like I could not get enough of walking tours. There's a company called London Walks, and they also have a Paris Walks arm. And in both those cities, that's my favorite thing in the world to do is just go on these walks. And when I was young and living there when I was 20, I really didn't have a ton of money, but you could go on these walks for like $5 and just learn and see so much of the city that you wouldn't otherwise know. So I wanted Sam to encounter someone kind of totally different from her, totally different from her own world, and really just kind of in a very random way. And those walking tour guides kind of came back to me, the way that you kind of just see them out in the city. And he thinks, when he meets her, oh, you're a tourist? Great, here's my brochure. And it turns into something neither of them expects.
Wow, I'm so glad I asked. That was a great story.
I think you're the first person who's asked me about that. So this is the first time I've told the story of the man in the spacesuit.
Well, there you go. Are you in touch with this guy at all, or would he even know that you wrote this book, or would he read it, or any way? Who knows?
Well, one thing I found out while I was writing this book was that his wife follows me on social media and does read my books. So they'll probably encounter
plot thickens.
Yeah, I know. Right. I'm waiting for the email. When I was a senior in college, also very much pulled from real life is this whole relationship with Elizabeth and Sam, and very much based on a woman whose child I took care of my senior year of college, and the relationship that we had. And she, through the process of my writing this book, publishing this book, and also I wrote an op-ed in the Times recently about babysitting, and mentioned her in it. She's gotten back in touch with me. And so now I'm emailing with her, and it's really lovely, and we're kind of back in each other's lives. So my best friend from college did say, I love that, but I really am just like bracing myself for the email from the spaceman.
Well, you are going to have to forward it to me now.
I will.
Or just tell me at least that it happened, and because now I'll be like, on pins and needles waiting. But, it's so interesting too, the relationship between, well, not just inappropriate men and younger women, but also the nanny mother dynamic, right? So, because I, like you, have been in both positions now. I used to be a mother's helper for this family for a long time, and I was a camp counselor and all this stuff, but I grew very close to the mom, who I'm still in touch with, by the way, and I was invited to like the girls' wedding who I babysat for. But now as a mom, like I have a close relationship, like my babysitter in the next room, she's 29, but we've been together for 6 years now, and it doesn't feel like a working relationship. Like there was the one scene in your book where Sam comes for dinner and she was going to help with Gil, and you said, Elizabeth says, "Oh no, you're off the clock." And she was like, "Well, am I ever on the clock? Like what is our relationship now?" And I totally got that. So talk to me now that you're on the other side, now that you're like on the mom side, how do you, like, do you feel like it informs how you deal with that relationship? Or I don't know, tell me more about it.
Yeah, I'm very aware of it, you know, and when my son was born, my kids are 16 months apart. So, you know, when my son was born, when he was 6 months old and I started looking for a nanny, truly I knew, and my husband also told me, you can't hire a nanny who's basically just graduated, you know, from Oberlin or whatever, and is basically like you as a 21-year-old, because you'll just end up like so enmeshed in one another's lives, which I think is probably true. And our nanny, you know, is actually like much older than me, a grown woman with her own adult children. So it wasn't an enmeshed thing as much as it's impossible to have someone who cares for your children, who loves your children, who is in your home every day, and who you get to know so well, and not form a personal relationship with them, or at least for me, it's impossible. And, you know, I also have always worked from home. So my kids' nanny and I would spend many, many, many hours talking about our lives. And I've done that on the babysitter side too, and on the nanny side too. So I think the only thing that I try to be aware of, because I've been on both sides, is, you know, when someone is in a position of being the employee, like they are not it's not equal footing all the time. Even though when you're the employer, you might feel it totally is. And I do feel like that. But, you know, that sense of, can there ever be a true friendship between two people, one of whom employs the other? And I think like everything that we've ever been taught about sort of workplace behavior, once you actually are in a workplace, you see that it's very rare that like sort of way you're supposed to act at work is how you act at work, because we spend a lot of our time at work. And these are the people we form relationships with, and it's complicated in a lot of cases. And I think, you know, with these two women too, it's complicated by their age. It's complicated by the fact that Elizabeth has been through, in a lot of ways, what Sam is about to go through. And so there's this element of her where she thinks, thank God I'm not 21. Thank God I sort of already know the answers to a lot of these questions. But also there's a little part of her that kind of is sad that that's behind her. And also, you know, as she tells Sam at one point, you know, Sam says she wants to be settled the way Elizabeth is. And Elizabeth says, like, you never feel settled. You just feel unsettled in new ways. And that's kind of the secret of being a middle-aged person. I think, you know, that sense, like, for me in my own life, my sister is 9 years younger than I am. So I feel like all through our lives, I've tried to be like, well, don't make that mistake. Don't do that thing. Or this thing is really hard, but it gets easier at XYZ point. And the thing is, like, these are the lessons you kind of have to learn for yourself, you know, and there might be some well-meaning person who loves you and wants it all to be smooth sailing, but that's just kind of not how life is.
Yeah. Nor does anyone ever take advice. I feel like,
totally.
I mean,
totally.
I'm always like, hey, you know, to any younger friends or any, you know, anyway, nobody ever listens to me. So I'm hoping it's
totally so true. So true.
So is your sister an Instagram influencer like Elizabeth's sister, or no?
She is not. And it's funny because I wrote this character, the Instagram influencer, before I myself was on Instagram. I'm pretty new to Instagram. So it was something that I was kind of researching as like an anthropologist. It was like another world I didn't know anything about, that there are these people who, you know, that's sort of how they make a living, or at least how they do whatever it is they want to do, acquire products or see the world or whatever. And, you know, in many ways, I thought her sister having this as her kind of job, kind of not job, was a perfect sort of encapsulation of this idea of the hollow tree, because we so often do see on social media, you know, oh, someone is having the most amazing life, but it's not always real. It's not always reflecting what's actually happening. And I think, you know, when I was writing this book, my sort of like overarching thought was going back to the Anne Lamott quote, don't compare your insides to their outsides. Because so often in this book, that is what people are doing. They're comparing their insides to other people's outsides and finding themselves lacking.
Very true. Well, I feel like, I don't know, I loved when you said that the sister puts her own thoughts in quotes.
Yes.
And Elizabeth's like, no, you can't like put your caption in quotes and quote yourself. And she's like, but other people are going to quote them. And she's like,
right,
anyway,
exactly.
I felt like
exactly.
your sense of humor in this book, it was like so understated and so funny. And even it felt like you weren't trying to be funny. You just were, which I loved that. I just loved it. There was even, when Elizabeth goes to the neighborhood book club and encounters like a whole crew of people, like, let's not even discuss how bad it is when you're in a book club and it with all the wrong people, which she was. But you said when she excused herself to go to the bathroom, you wrote, she had to pass through the kitchen to get there. The word eat was spelled out on the wall in giant metal letters. Perhaps Stephanie needed a regular reminder of what the room was for. I like laughed out loud at that. Anyway, I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Have you been in a book club that you didn't feel was a fit? Or have you been in a book club, or are you in one now? Or
I was in a book club years ago, like in my early 20s. I haven't been in one for a long time. I've only experienced book clubs as an author, going and reading or going and speaking to book clubs, which I do occasionally. I went to my mother's book club on the street I grew up on a couple years ago. And, you know, I was like, usually if I go to a book club, it's kind of a big deal. Like maybe somebody, you know, won this as an auction item or something, and they're excited, right? But in the case of my mother's book club, I took the train from New York. I, you know, expected it to be the way it usually is. And instead they were like, good job writing that book, honey. We loved it. Anyway, did you hear that blah, 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 saw blah, 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 doing blah, blah, blah. And I was like, really? That's it? I'm only going to get like 2 minutes of coverage here before we turn to the gossip and the Pinot Grigio. And so I think that a little bit inspired that book club. And it's funny because the book club scene in the book it's really been very controversial. There's been a lot of different people. Yes, there have been people in my life and in also my agent's life who are like, is that based on my book club? A lot of people think it's based on their book club. So I guess there are a lot of book clubs where people don't read the books and just gossip, which I actually I would love to be in that kind of a book club. Sign me up.
We should start one.
Let's do that. I feel like, you know, I don't know. On the one hand, as a former English major, you know, I do miss that thing where you're talking about a book with other people and they are bringing out parts of it you didn't necessarily notice or realize. But I do feel like as an adult that reading time is so scarce, and I want to always be reading what I want to read. It would be really hard for me to be like, well, you know, Mary had to pick the book this month, so I'm going to read what she picked. I know that's how book clubs work, but I guess I just don't play well with others. I don't know. Are you in a book club?
Well, I actually had that same problem, and I just started my own so that I could pick all the books. So it's called Zibby's virtual book club, and I should have you on. I should have thought to invite you. Anyway, please come. But I do it every 2 weeks, and the author comes for the second half, so we can have like a 30-minute talk about the book, like intellectually and, you know, themes and whatever else you want to talk about. Anyway,
I like that.
Yeah, but
and
it's
really
fun.
talk about the book.
We really talk because I don't even know these people. It's from like, I'm like, anyone can come. So yeah, but
love that.
I was in like one book club a long time ago, and then I dropped out of my current book club because I didn't like any of the books. So yeah, finding your people. But I guess that goes to the point in your book too, is sort of what Elizabeth is struggling with in terms of just finding her people, finding her community in a new place, and how awful that can be, and how she talks about being like a middle schooler all over again, right? It's like the worst feeling. She's like eyeing moms on the playground and just feeling so left out. And it's something that I feel like doesn't get enough sort of airspace as grown-ups, that there's still that same sense of like in-group, out-group dynamics and all of that still happens. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen to you now in Boston or whatever.
People are, it's interesting because as an adult, right, you're not going to be like bullied on the playground, but you are going to encounter that like our group is already, our lunch table is already full, move along kind of mentality maybe. Yeah. And that's definitely what Elizabeth feels. She feels, I don't fit in here. These people have, known each other for so long. I'm coming in too late in the game to be part of this story. But, over time, I think she comes to see some goodness in her neighbors. But I think, my husband's grandmother, who's 94 years old, she said to me one time, we were looking at houses, and she was like, people go and they look at a house and they think about, how old is the roof, or like, do I love the interior or whatever. She said, but really the most important thing, which you can never really know ahead of time, is who are your neighbors? Mm-hmm. Because that's going to determine so much of the rest of your life. And that kind of like amazed me and horrified me at the same time. I hadn't really considered it. And I think it's true, especially if you live really close together the way that they do in this neighborhood. And so, Elizabeth has moved to this college town, and she imagines she's going to be surrounded by intellectuals, and those people do exist in the town she lives in, but they don't exist on her block, and she, even when she meets her friend Gwen, thinks to herself, had I bought a house 2 blocks away, I'd have this interesting professor on one side and I'd have Gwen on the other side. But as it is, I'm living with the townies who just want to gossip about everyone in town.
It's also how it works in colleges a lot of the time too. Like, oh, if only I had been in the room on that floor instead of my floor, maybe those would have been my friends. It's like, look at the draw in life, right? You just,
and again, it's kind of like meeting the walking tour guide in the middle of Leicester Square because you had to go to the bathroom, so you crossed, over to Burger King to go to the bathroom instead of just waiting in line at the bar or whatever. I mean, so much of life is that way. So much of life is down to things we don't necessarily consider, these sort of chance encounters. And I think both women in this book are the type of women who want to be able to control everything, want to be able to plot out their own destinies, their own futures. But we really can't, so life will surprise us no matter how much we plan.
Yes, very true. You wrote really well also about the dynamics of dealing with more difficult parents, right? So you talked about how Elizabeth invited all of her parents, not all, but her divorced parents and her father with the girlfriend and all of that. And then of course, immediately regrets it, which I'm sure anybody who has that dynamic can probably relate to. And she said, wait, hold on, I have to find it. Let's see. She was, so this is how she felt like right after realizing she had done this and made a mistake. She was irritable while they ate and afterward watching TV, annoyed about her family's intrusion into their life, and even more so about the stupid sliver of hope in her that maybe this time would be different. And it's like, why do you like, people always just keep hoping that their parents are going to change and that they don't. So have you had something sort of like this, sort of these immediate regrets of after?
Well, I come from a very large family, and there's always people upset at one another for various reasons. And I think what you just said, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's sort of like the conversations that they're having, family members are having about one another and what displeases them, the same conversations they were having 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it's like the dynamics just never change as much as you wish they would or hope they would. So, I think also when you have a baby, I think, you know, it's funny, like in New York, if you live in New York and you're not a native New Yorker, it can kind of seem like people don't have families. Like you're just like this bunch of like orphans floating around in your 20s, you know? I feel it's kind of like when you watch Sex and the City and you're like, do any of them have families? Are they from anywhere? But that's kind of how it feels in your 20s in New York when you come from somewhere else. And it's not until, you know, these life events, like you're having a wedding or you are having a baby, that people's parents sort of enter the scene. And I think in a more internal way, a sense of, even if I don't live near these people, you know, what have I inherited that I want to or really don't want to pass along to this new generation of this family? And so I think she's really struggling with that because she wants to be a good mother. She loves her baby, but she doesn't really have a roadmap from her own dysfunctional childhood as to what to do.
Yeah, you're so right about that in New York. I am a native New Yorker, and I grew up like loving coming out here to the Hamptons and loving the East Hampton Library, and that's why this event is like so meaningful and everything like that. But it's true. The friends you meet, it's like, well, you didn't even know I had a brother? Like,
Right.
Right.
Yes.
It's like all these things that it seems so obvious, but when you are later in life, especially in New York, it's like nobody ever finds out or meets your parents, or, I mean, my parents were in New York, but anyway.
Yeah.
And you had another thing about the mother, speaking of like once you have a baby and how that changes your relationship. You said she didn't, and Elizabeth is speaking about her mother. She didn't think she would care when her withholding, inattentive mother inevitably turned out to be a withholding, inattentive grandmother, but she did care sometimes.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
A lot of times I think babies can change grandparents a little bit, or you see sides of them that maybe weren't there before, or people can resent the fact that their parents are like so much nicer to their kids, right, than they ever were to them.
That's true. Yes. Yes, that is true. And I do think, you know, now I wrote this book like before my kids were, when I was pregnant with my son. So really it covered the same amount of time as having both my children. And I have been actually amazed at like the relationships between my parents and my kids, because they just adore each other in both directions. And my son especially is like obsessed with my dad to the point, actually both my parents, but he will always attribute anything to my dad. Like he wants to watch a TV show, he's like, my grandpa loves this show. My grandpa loves, you know, Paw Patrol. I'm like, does he? You know, they're like movie stars to him. So like that is very sweet to see, I have to say. And it does create, like you said, a kind of a new dimension to a old longstanding relationship that has been interesting.
Yes. I feel like I should tell people who are still like living at home and really struggling with their parents, like, you know, in like 20 years or so, 30 years, just you wait. Like,
exactly.
It might turn around all on its own, you know, don't give up. One other thing also about New York versus LA, which you talk about in the book, speaking of like what it's like, I loved your orphan visual. That was awesome. You wrote, New Yorkers reveled in complaining about the city, the crowds, the subway delays, the hassle. Every sane person wanted to go somewhere else. New Yorkers could best be understood not by where they lived, but by where they talked about escaping to, LA or Portland or Austin or wherever they came from to begin with. And yet when someone left, it shocked her.
Yeah.
So
it has always really like shocked me when friends have left. I mean, I guess I've left now, but I haven't even like accepted that reality. But you know, yeah, there's something about New York that it's bigger than just where you live. It's like this idea. And I don't know, it's, you know, but then at the same time, I mean, I remember especially there was like a wave where so many people I knew moved to Austin, Texas, and the way they talked about it was like so foreign. They would just say, it's wonderful. We love it. We love everything about it. And I felt like, well, that people in New York are never like that. They might love New York, but they'll also complain, you know, about every possible thing there is to complain about. And it is interesting just to see how different people relate to the cities they live in.
So
And New York has the strongest reaction, I would say, positive and negative. There's something about New York, like it's so, I don't know if you encounter this ever, but like my husband is from Iowa. So when we go there, you know, so many people in our lives say things like I would never, you couldn't pay me to live where you live, you know, or like I could handle it for a weekend, but I could never, you know, it seems like the worst place to live. And it's like, it seems like if you said that about any other place, it would be sort of offensive, but somehow it's not offensive because you're just like, it's almost like a point of pride that, well, I can live there. So, you know, I don't know.
Yeah. If you were like, if you said that to the people in Iowa, that would not go over very well. If you were
Right.
like,
If
I can't imagine living here.
Yeah, I can't imagine living in Des Moines. I can't stay here for more than 2 days. I'd be like, get the hell out of here. You're so rude.
Say that out loud. No, my husband grew up in Florida, and every winter he's like, you know, you don't have to live in the Northeast. Like, there are other climates. Why do you insist on this? I'm like, I don't know. It's just part of it. It's just,
I know.
You know, I don't know.
I know.
Although
it's
I
so
feel
true.
like now, I don't know. I feel like coronavirus has sort of robbed the city of something. And I don't know, unlike 9/11, where everybody was like, we know it's going to come back. This was like an isolated thing. I don't know. For the first time, I'm like, I don't know. Maybe it's over. Maybe the magic is gone, but I don't know. So you're gone. That's it.
I don't think the magic is gone. I think it's coming back, but I do think it's.
Oh no, I'm losing you.
It's gonna and there was a real push to. Oh no, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, you're coming back. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Sorry, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, should I just keep saying that for the next half hour? Can you hear me?
No, I got you now. Okay, I don't know what that was, but I think we're
sorry.
Past. Okay.
Sorry. No, but yes, I do think. I don't know. I just can't imagine that it's not coming back. But I just feel like there are so many people. Like I was always a person who felt like eventually I would live in the suburbs. Just kind of knew that about myself. And I think that for us, this has just made that happen a little sooner. But I have been really shocked and surprised by how many people in my life who I always considered like lifelong diehard New Yorkers who are leaving. It's kind of troubling.
Yeah, I'm in that boat at the moment. I really don't want to leave it out here. I mean, this is great.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, but I might have to with schools and everything. But yes, it's a trying time no matter where you are, really. Tell me just a few minutes about what it was like writing this book. Like, where did you write this book? How long did it take you to write it? What your process was like?
Yeah. So I started writing it when I was pregnant with my first child. And, you know, it really, the sort of idea for the book came about maybe 10 years ago when I was back at my alma mater, Smith College, to give a reading. And I came out after this event and I was walking to my car and came to a crosswalk, and I was standing there waiting for the light to change. And I was just kind of thinking, you know, what had happened in the 10 years since I had left, and that I had wanted to be a writer. And now I was back here giving a reading from my novel. And this big SUV pulled up to the crosswalk, and driving the SUV was this woman whose child I had cared for my senior year of college, who had really, in many ways, kind of put me on the path to my future, to going to New York, to becoming a writer. And I was waving at her. I was like, hi, oh my gosh, it's me. She had no idea who I was and kept driving. At that point, you know, she'd had 2 more kids, and it had been 10 years. I'm sure she'd had so many babysitters by then. And so she just didn't recognize me. But I went back to New York that night, and I was telling a friend who's also a writer, Jamie Attenberg, the story. And Jamie said, oh, that sounds like a great first chapter for a novel. You know, these 2 women, and they know each other, but one of them isn't acknowledging it. And I kind of like did see this sort of shimmer around it that tells me, oh, that's a good idea. But I didn't really know yet why or what I would write about. But when I was pregnant with my son, I felt like, oh, I see it now, because soon I will have been both these women. You know, I still remember the experience of being the Sam-like character, this college-age girl, but soon I will also know the inner life of this new mother and what that looks like. So when I was pregnant, when I was home with an infant for the first 6 months, I was just always taking notes. And I was doing that. I mean, when you have a newborn, you know, you're not really even able to like take out a pen and jot something down, but I always had my phone and I would just email myself notes, whether it was like a funny thing that happened or, you know, something that I saw on a Facebook mom's message board or whatever that I thought would be interesting to include, or a plot point that I didn't want to forget. And I would just email them to myself all under the same subject line. And, you know, when he was 6 months old and I really sat down to write the book, I then could just search my email and had this kind of trail of breadcrumbs I'd left for myself with all these notes about where this story could go. And it was about a 2-year process of writing the book from there, during which I had my second child. And, you know, it's funny because I started writing it when my son was 6 months old. And a friend of mine had gone to LA for work, and she lived a couple of blocks from me, and she was so kind and offered to let me work out of her apartment. And there was something just so amazing about having that space to myself, which, you know, when you have a new baby is just not something that you have. And so I started going there. I was writing like I had never written before. It was just like pouring out of me because I had been wanting to write for all these months, but just did not have the time or the energy. And, but maybe about a month into that, I was like going over writing for a couple of hours, and then I would just fall asleep on her couch every day. And I was like, I guess I'm just really tired because I have a 7-month-old and whatever, you know, but it turned out I was pregnant again. So it was kind of a good thing in a way. It really forced me to be like, you better finish this draft because there is a real thing that's going to happen in a matter of months. It's going to, again, kind of stop you from being able to write. And then when my daughter was born, I kind of put the book away for 3 months and you know, did the new baby thing again. And it was helpful actually, because I was able to come back to it with really fresh eyes, which I always want to do with a book, but I don't always have the patience to do it.
Well, you couldn't have scripted that any better. I mean, that was like perfect timing.
Yes.
Excellent. Oh my gosh. Do you know how many words? I was just wondering because your book was, because I compare it to some other books. I feel like there were a lot of words on each page. And then when I went to download the audio, it said it would be 14 hours. So I was like, okay, forget that. I'm just going to read it.
Wow. That's
yeah.
I don't know how many words it is. It's really long. All my books are so freaking long. They're all about 500 pages in a Word document, whatever that is, double spaced. So it's funny because all of my books, this is my 5th novel, they all come out to be about the exact same length, like 518 pages or something, give or take like 3 pages. It's really strange. And with this book, I actually thought it was going to be my short book. I was really excited. Like, I'm going to write a short book. And I think it was 300 pages. And we were like, great, that's going to be the length. But then there were so many things we wanted to expand on that it ended up being the same length as all the other ones.
Too funny. No, it was great. I mean, there's nothing I would have wanted to have been taken out or anything, you know. It was, I didn't mean to. I don't know. I don't know.
No. I get it. It's just weird. It's like you kind of write. I don't know what it is. I think, you know, I was talking to a friend who is also a novelist whose novels are much shorter generally, and she just said, you know, there are certain departures that you go down, you know, that I wouldn't go down. Like, it's just a style thing. But like, you know, going back and talking about these people Sam babysat for 2 years ago and how they wronged her, you know, it has nothing to do with this story, but it's in there, you know. So a lot of that and a lot of kind of looking at where these people came from and all of that. But I mean, my last book was like, it covered 50 years in a family, and it was the exact same length as this one, which is like 2 women, 1 year. So it is weird.
Are you working on a new book now?
Oh, not really. I I have an idea for a new book. But since COVID started, it's really just like get through the days with these children, but I am starting to feel a real need to get back to it. So I think what I have to do is like realize that even if I don't have a whole day to sit down and write, if I do a little at a time, if I do an hour or two each day, that will still add up. Because generally I'm much more like, if I don't have this long 6-hour stretch, there's no point kind of a thing. But I'm clearly going to have to change that.
At least for the short term.
Yeah.
Although some people were saying, that having too much time is also problematic, that sometimes the intensity of like having to get it out, and if you only have an hour, making the best of the hour, you'll get all your good stuff. So who knows? We'll see.
It's true. It's true. I do find that for me, the hardest part is really getting in the zone, getting into the world of that story. And that takes me so long. And once I'm in it, the time just flies. Like hours go by, it doesn't feel like hours have gone by, but it's not always even possible, let alone easy to get there for me. So it's like, if I give myself an hour, I'm just starting to be like, to stop thinking of other ways I can distract myself and things I need to look at on my computer, just sort of getting into it. But it is true, I think, that having less time somehow makes you more focused in general.
Or just having to tolerate more distractions while you do it, right? Like taking the time, but your kids are still around, and
yes,
it is what it is.
Exactly. Yes, that is true. Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure everybody else gets to ask you questions. I feel like I could sit here and ask you questions all night, but I want to open it up to our guests here tonight.
And the question I have is different. It's not about the writing process. It's about actually the design of your book cover, which is a real departure from your previous novels.
Yeah.
And I have to confess that I bought your book Maine because I was a sucker. I'm a sucker for a beautiful cover, especially for my summer reading. And I grabbed your book Maine. I was pulled in by the cover. And your new book, Friends and Strangers, has such a different style than the previous novels. I love the design as well. But I'm just curious if you could talk about that. I think it's interesting, the style and why you chose that and why you went in a different direction than your previous novels.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. I love that question. And, it's funny because I think as an author, you have much less of a say in a jacket than you might think as a reader. So if you absolutely hate the jacket and you just cannot live with it, they'll probably change it or show you other options. But generally speaking, you're sort of supposed to kind of let them, it's tricky because I think when you're a writer and you've created this whole world, no matter what one single still image is presented to you, it can be hard to say, oh, okay, yes, that's the image I had in my mind. Oftentimes, or you might think like there's one thing that would be so perfect for the cover. I remember thinking for Maine, it should be, there's a beach house, but when you look more closely, it's a dollhouse because Anne Marie is so obsessed with dollhouses in the book. And I thought that was brilliant. But of course, like they people who actually do this for a living were like, that's really no, we're not doing that. And I remember being really, my first novel, Commencement, was like, I loved the jacket. I loved the color, loved everything. Maine, I was really mad about it when I first saw it because I was like, this is a book about these women, this family of women. They have enormous thighs and they don't look like this. And they would like murder someone to look like this in a bathing suit. I just was so annoyed about that. And also that the woman was blonde on the cover and they were like, okay, we hear you. We're going to change it. And they brought it back to me and it was the exact same picture, but she had brown hair. And, but over time, I have come to really love that jacket. I think the colors are so beautiful. I think it's a really arresting image. And it's been, an honor because a lot of people have sort of copied it. So I feel like that's kind of like a testament to how beautiful it is. Friends and Strangers is the first jacket I've had where I received an email, you know, saying, here's the jacket for the book. And I was prepared to hate it because I often do sort of hate the first one that I see. And I just loved it. It was this final cover that was the first and only one they ever showed me. And it's interesting because it isn't, I don't know, it doesn't tell you that much, you know, directly about this book, but somehow it really conveys something, you know, it conveys the intimacy, the conversations, the kind of oversharing element that comes out, especially when women are drinking wine together. And, you know, there's just something about it that I loved. And I kind of loved that it had sort of like a throwback feel about it with the colors.
Definitely, yeah.
It's interesting too, because you'll see sort of with jackets that it's almost like with fashion, that there'll be a sort of a trend that happens. So I have noticed like a lot of books that came out this summer have this really vibrant kind of rainbow color effect. And it's just funny because like clearly these designers were not working in concert with one another, but it just sort of seems to be the thing that people are pulled toward right now.
Oh, wait, you have to unmute yourself. Here, wait.
Sorry.
Wait, I still can't hear her.
Oh, Carrie.
Carrie has to unmute. Carrie, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that, guys. Yeah, you know what I think? Honestly, I think that I looked at it 3 times before I realized it kind of revealed itself to me. It looks like a beautiful, attractive, abstract design. And then you look more closely and you see the white line drawings of the hands and the glasses. And it's a great design. It's just so different. And I didn't know that, that as an author, you don't have that much of control over that. That's really interesting. I guess we just think that you know, were probably presented with a dozen options, or that you have some say, but that's interesting to know that that's out of your hands in many ways.
Yeah, and sometimes you are presented with options. You're usually, in my experience at least, like they really let you know which one they like, which, you know, it's really like a team effort in the sense that this is what salespeople think is the best thing. Or in recent years now, you know, I published my first novel 11 years ago. So all of the kind of technological advances that have happened with books have happened in the span of that time. And one thing I've noticed with this book and the last one too, they're much more interested in how does a book look on screen now, even than how does it look in person, because so many people are first encountering a cover online.
Interesting.
Anybody, are there any other questions?
A question. How did you get your first book published? What was the story of your first book?
That's a great question. So I was very, very lucky. I think the sort of important thing when you're publishing a book is that you have to have an agent. The agent is the person who's going to kind of shepherd you through the process and help you find the right editor, the right publishing house, and all of that. And I think it's like almost impossible. Maybe there are 1 or 2 exceptions that any author published by a large publishing house doesn't have an agent. So getting that agent is usually the really hard part. For me, I was always a writer. I always wrote short stories from the time I was a little kid, and I was working on a novel when I was in college, and it just, you know, it was what I loved to do. So I was an intern at the Atlantic Monthly when I was in college, and I got to work for the fiction editor there, Michael Curtis, which was a wonderful situation. And he asked me at some point if I wrote fiction. I told him that I did, and he very generously offered to read some of my stories and told me to keep sending my work in. He was very encouraging. And so he ended up giving some of my stories to a woman who was an editor there at the time named Lucy Prince, who had hired me and hired all the interns. And she said, oh, I would love to share these stories you wrote with an agent I know who's just starting out. Her name is Brittany Bloom. She was an intern here last year. And I was like, great. And so I, at that time, was like 19 or 20. And Brittany, I think, is just a few years older than I am. And we met and we talked, and she's still my agent. It's been 20 years that we've been together. So, that piece of it, I was so lucky to kind of like fall into it. Because I think once that part is established, the rest is a lot. I mean, it's not easy, but it's a lot easier. And Brittany, by the way, I wrote 2 novels that she said in her lovely diplomatic way. She said, I just don't see this as your first novel. And what she really meant was, I don't see this as a novel you're ever going to publish. But, it was a nice way of saying it. And so it's like, okay, I'll put that in a drawer for later and I'll write another one. And so, it wasn't like an immediate thing where it was 8 years between us first meeting and my first novel selling. But we were in conversation that whole time.
I have a question. Since a lot of what you write is based on life experiences that you've had and change them a little bit, do you think in the next novel you write, you will include some of the way we're living differently now, or you'll purposely avoid it, sort of like, the good old days, the way things used to be, and sort of how we would prefer them to go back to being, and not talk about what's going on now?
Right now, right this second, I think I'm going to do the latter. I think I'm going to just pretend this never happened, but I want to, or, set the book actually just a few years ago so that we're not living in a world in which this is happening or has happened. But I don't know. It's such a weird thing. And I guess we all have hoped and continue to hope that it's like going away soon, sometime. But, I don't know if you all have experienced this, but I have experienced in the last like 2 or 3 weeks that so many people in my life, including myself, have had this like have kind of hit a new wall with all of this, where I think it's because school is starting soon, and we kind of had this feeling that let's just like kind of let this summer be, time that doesn't matter. And then in September, the kids are going to go to school, the kids are going to go to daycare, it's all going to be normal again. And it's like dawning on so many people that no, it's really not going to be. And so I feel like, there are just these waves with all of this that we go through, and it's impossible to know how long we will continue to do that. And so if we're still doing that in, several months from now, on the one hand, I don't really want to write a novel about this. On the other hand, I don't know if you can write about it, or if you can write anything without in some way addressing it, acknowledging it, or it making its way in there. It's really going to be an interesting time. I mean, I already thought it was going to be an interesting time for novels before COVID, because the world has changed in a lot of ways in recent years, but what novelists will do with this is going to be interesting, because we can't all write a COVID novel, because no one's going to want to read, 63 COVID novels in 2022, but it will certainly influence what we write.
Yeah, interesting.
Any other questions?
Well, I have one more question. I'm always looking for recommendations. Of course, I have a whole pile of books for the summer. I'm in the middle of reading the book Beach Read right now. I just finished Jennifer Weiner's book that also has an Instagram influencer as a main character you were talking about earlier. And then next up, I'm savoring my Elin Hildebrand book for the remainder of August. What are you reading this summer? And do you have any good recommendations for summer reading?
The book, I have a couple of recommendations. So I just read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo, which is absolutely fantastic. Such an amazing read. And the other book that I just love so much, I want to like sell it on the street corner, just hand it out to everyone, is Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I'm obsessed with this book. On my Zoom book tour so far, you know, usually at book tour events, I will do a reading, but I haven't been doing that because it's Zoom and it just feels weird. I haven't read from my own book at all on book tour, but I've read from Lily King's book, I think 3 times, because it's so amazing. And there are all these passages that I just am like, I can't do it justice. I have to just read it.
I wrote those down and I will take note of those. And I actually feel the name of the first author who wrote Girl, Woman, Other. Who is that?
Bernardine Evaristo, Evaristo.
I feel so bad for her because people are probably like, person, woman, man, camera, TV, right?
Well, that
like,
too.
oh,
Yes,
Girl,
right.
Woman, Other.
Right.
Thanks. I wrote down those 2 books. I'm going to put those on my queue.
Thank you. Good.
We're at the end of our hour. Thank you for participating in Authors Night. We really appreciate your support and your help for the East Hampton Library. Thank you again to Zibby. And would you like to say anything to close, Zibby?
No, just thank you all for tuning in. Check out my podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. You can listen to my episode with Courtney and also with Lily King, actually, Writers and Lovers. And I agreed with you, by the way. That was one of my favorites I've read recently. I stayed up till like 2 a.m. Couldn't put it down.
So good. Me too.
So thank you all for supporting the East Hampton Library, which has a special place in my heart. And thank you to Courtney for spending all this time with us tonight. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks.